Thank you very much for coming on the programme, Mr Corbyn. So it feels like there is renewed optimism about the chances of some kind of Brexit deal being agreed. Now, I know these are only reports at this stage, but from what you've heard, is it something that you think Labour could support?
Not that I've heard so far, although, as you say, it is unsubstantiated reports. I think the problem areas are of regulation and deregulation, which come from whatever trade arrangement there is with Europe and the wider world, but also perhaps very seriously is the Irish border issue. And if it creates a border down the Irish Sea rather than on the Irish border itself, I can see that being problems.
And with that in mind, how would you treat any Labour MP that did decide to back this deal if it does come back to the House of Commons?
Well, I'll talk to them about it, but at the moment we're actually dealing with hypotheticals. So I'm not even sure the Prime Minister knows what the deal is going to be as yet. And so we'll obviously have a discussion about it within the Parliamentary Labour Party and with colleagues and decide how we go from here. But our principles are around the 5 pillars that I put forward in my letter to Theresa May some months ago, and what we stuck to, which is of a customs union with the European Union, a trade arrangement and protection of consumer, environmental and working rights, and crucially the support for the Irish peace process, which, remember, the Good Friday Agreement is not a bilateral agreement, it's an international agreement, it's a treaty.
At the same time though, this is the defining political issue of the moment. You will have a position on whether or not to back any deal that comes. If a Labour MP goes against your agreed line, could they have the whip withdrawn?
We will decide what our voting process is when we know what the deal is. I can't really answer a question on whether we support a deal or not, which we haven't yet seen, and I don't think any Labour MP is yet able to answer that question either.
Would you be more likely to back any deal if it was put to a confirmatory referendum?
I think many in Parliament, not necessarily Labour MPs, but others might be more inclined to support it, even if they don't really agree with the deal. But I would caution them on this, because my view would be that I would want a deal that resembles the 5 pillars that we put forward, and that obviously would command support, and obviously does have wide support within the Labour Party and the trade unions.
But don't you need to compromise a bit? I mean, if it was put to a referendum, you could argue in that referendum that it was a bad deal?
I want us to protect those workers' rights, consumer and environmental rights. I want us to have that trade relationship with Europe. Look, in the week when Nissan says there's a question mark over Sunderland because of the possibility of a no-deal exit from the European Union, and we're already seeing job losses across the country, and we're seeing siren calls from businesses and unions all over the country about job losses, I think we've got to be very, very cautious.
So again, I know we are in hypothetical still, but if a deal does come back next week or towards the end of next week, what should come first? A second referendum or a general election?
We have to get a deal that we can agree on if possible, and the Labour position is that we would take this to a public vote under a Labour government, which within 3 months we would hope to reach agreement with the European Union. We believe that to be possible along the lines that we've set out, and within 6 months hold a referendum, and a Labour government would then implement the results of that referendum between a sensible relationship with Europe and Remain.
So just to be clear, it sounds like you're going for an election first and then a referendum.
We'll look at any deal that comes up before we trigger an election.
And when should an election be?
Well, it obviously depends what happens this week, but we have a government that is now in -40, hasn't yet won a vote in Parliament, and having the Queen's speech and the state opening of Parliament tomorrow is ludicrous. Utterly ludicrous. What we've got, in effect, is a party political broadcast from the steps of the throne.
So do you think there should be an election before Christmas? Is that the kind of time frame you're looking at?
That is obviously a strong possibility, but listen, we're ready for an election at any time, because I want to go out there. I want to go out there and campaign on health, on housing, on ending universal credit, on investment for the future, on the green industrial revolution, all the things that our party has very strong and very exciting policies on.
But it's in your hands. Surely you want it as soon as possible.
No, it's not in my hands.
Before Christmas.
We're not a majority in Parliament. I wish we were, but we're not.
But if the government wants an election and you back an election, then you'll get an election.
If over 430 MPs vote for an election, there is an election. It's the Fixed Term Parliament Act is not an either or. It is an aggregation of those that vote for it. Those that vote against don't count.
Now, we've been talking a bit about what would happen if a deal is brought back next week, but of course there is still a big chance that no deal is agreed. And according to the Benn Act, if there isn't a deal agreed by next weekend, then Boris Johnson must request an extension to Brexit. If he doesn't, when will you hold a vote of confidence?
He is under a legal obligation, if no deal has been agreed by Parliament, to write the letter, send the letter that has been passed by the EU number 2, as you call it, the Ben Act. If he doesn't do that, he's then in breach of the law.
So what would you do then?
We'd obviously take parliamentary action against him at that point.
And is that a vote of confidence?
Either by legislation or a vote of confidence.
And if, of course, he loses a confidence vote, then there would be 2 weeks for someone else to come forward, become Prime Minister, request that extension. Now, I know that you, as Leader of the Opposition, clearly feel that that should be you.
Of course. I'm the Leader of the Opposition. The whole precedent, all the British parliamentary precedents going back as long as you care to look, are that the first option is the Leader of the Opposition be invited to form an administration in order to deal with specific points, the specific points being to make sure we get a deal with the European Union.
But if you can't get the numbers, and I know you want to and you think you should, but if you can't get the numbers, could you consider backing someone else if it is the way to stop a no-deal exit?
I'm not going to hypotheticals. We will form an administration if this government collapses with the purpose of a deal and take this country forward to decide its own future through an election, and the people get a chance to decide their future through a referendum. After all, a referendum made its decision in 2016. This would be a decision time between remain and hopefully some reforms, or leave under the terms that I've outlined.
Because if you won't even consider the thought of someone else leading a temporary government, then some of our viewers may conclude that actually you prioritise getting to number 10 over stopping a no-deal Brexit.
My priority is that our Parliament should decide what the future should be in the immediate sense. All the precedents are the Leader of the Opposition is invited to form an administration. I've been holding meetings with all of the opposition parties regularly in my office. We are agreed on stopping a no-deal exit from the European Union, and as a result of that, significant progress has been made in Parliament, such as the passage of the Ben Act. Is there agreement on other things? Obviously not. We're opposition parties that don't agree on a whole range of political issues, but I think I've shown that the Labour Party is more than prepared to work with others in the interest of protecting this country from the dangers of a no-deal exit.
But it sounds a bit like, the meatloaf approach to Brexit. You'll do anything to stop a no-deal apart from that. That's the one thing you just won't contemplate
I will do
doing.
everything to stop a no-deal exit, including offering us to be an interim, obviously minority administration with the specific point of reaching an agreement and taking the country forward to give the people a choice.
So if you were in that position, can you guarantee that you would only request an extension and then call an election? You would not implement a single piece of Labour Party policy?
Well, we wouldn't have a majority to get any legislation through anyway, so that is not an option. We are not a majority party in Parliament. Obviously, I wish we were. Our purpose would be
But could you try?
Well, I don't think there'd be much point because we don't have a majority to get things through. Obviously, immediate issues that come up whilst that government is in office, albeit for probably a very short time, would have to be dealt with. Things happen around the world, things happen around the country. Governments have to act.
So you can't rule out then implementing policy, can you?
You can't. You can never say never about that, but the point of the government would be a short-term government in order to take things forward.
OK. Now, we know, of course, that Labour want to see a referendum on Brexit. So in that referendum, would you campaign to leave or remain?
What we'd hold is a special Labour Party conference when we've reached the agreement with the European Union, and that party conference would decide what we would do. The point of it is we would have an option of remaining, and I would personally hope reforming within the European Union, as I said in the last referendum campaign, or leaving on these terms, which are trade, which are regulations, and crucially protecting the Good Friday Agreement.
Because can you not see people's exasperation, I guess, that you can't really say how you would campaign in a referendum?
We're the party that tries to bring people together. We have people who are Labour voters who both voted leave and remain. And obviously they have different opinions on that. But they have the same opinions on ending universal credit, on the green industrial revolution, on investment, on the poverty of seaside towns such as we're in at the present time. That's what brings people together. We give people that choice.
But Brexit is arguably the biggest political decision since, the end of World War II.
So
and people are looking to you for leadership, and they will feel, some of them, that you're sitting on the fence.
No, we're bringing it down. I'm giving people a choice between remaining or leaving with these terms. At the moment, the only thing on offer seems to be Boris Johnson taking us over a cliff.
Let's move on from Brexit. We are here in Hastings. If Labour were in government, what would you do to help coastal towns like this one?
Well, first of all, coastal towns have a uniquely difficult situation at the present time. Income levels, average income levels are about £1,500 less than inland towns, partly because of changes in the tourist industry, partly because of loss of fishing industry, and partly because of deindustrialisation, which has happened in many places. Yet seaside towns are a very important place that people live, and they need investment and they need support. One, starting with, we'll be doing a green industrial revolution, which will be an investment in offshore wind electricity generation projects, and we'll be setting up an electricity company, a people's electricity company, some of the profits of which will be invested in those seaside towns for people to decide the future of them. But we'll also be ending universal credit, which is a big factor in many seaside towns, has led to a great deal of poverty, has led to the freezing of benefits, and has led to, sadly, with the implementation of the capability of work assessment tests, people even taking their own lives out of desperation. So for seaside towns, it's going to be investment, it's going to be spending money on offshore wind projects, it's going to be also improved infrastructure projects through regional investment funds. In this country, the poorest seaside towns are actually all around on the south coast where we are at the moment, northeast coast, northwest coast, and it does mean that we have to have a much better regional policy in this country. And so we will be having, yes, a national investment bank, but we'll be having regional transformation funds where the regions themselves, the English regions, will decide on how that money is spent, and obviously there will be parallel opportunities in Scotland and Wales.
There was research that I was looking at earlier from the Department for Education earlier this year, which said that in seaside towns like Hastings and elsewhere, disadvantaged pupils are, on average, getting 3 GCSE grades lower than elsewhere. Now, at Labour conference, delegates came up with a pretty radical policy to try and tackle disadvantages in the education system, the abolition of private schools. So is that Labour policy?
Labour policy is to make sure that private education is not a charity but pays tax just like anybody else, and that the local education authority has far more influence over the way in which education operates. Obviously we'll be deciding exactly what goes into the manifesto. The key point will be a national education service which will guarantee free nursery places for all 2 to 4 year olds, properly funded primary and secondary schools, ending Key Stage 1 and 2 testing, an inspection system which isn't Ofsted, which instead is HMI, Majesty's Inspector of Education, much more supportive system, and crucially, equality of opportunity for both apprenticeships and university, and ending university fees.
There's a big difference though, isn't there, between ending the charitable status of private schools and getting rid of them. So which is it? What do you want to see?
I want to see all children basically in good quality publicly funded schools. That's what my ambition is, and I would therefore be supporting better investment and better running of state schools, particularly comprehensive schools.
Do you think it would be fairer if there weren't private schools?
I think private schools are often seen as a slight an elitist thing. Children only go there because their parents can afford it or are prepared to make the sacrifices to try to get them there. What I'd much rather is investment in the public sector schools where all children get an advantage. What we have is a country where opportunity is often denied to the poorest people because they live in the poorest areas that often have the worst schools and the worst opportunities. You quite rightly pointed out that achievements of students in seaside towns is sometimes less than other places. That is a reflection often of poverty and of the prevalence of the private rented sector and insecure housing, which often means children move schools. We've got to radically change the approach to people's lives.
Could you go into the election with a policy to abolish private schools? Is that on the table?
What we'll go into the election for is the establishment of a national education service which will properly fund all state education.
Not quite what I asked, though,
no, I know it isn't. And we'll end the charitable status of private schools. As to the other parts of it, that is open for discussion at the moment within our party before it goes into our manifesto.
Okay. Conference also voted for a very ambitious target to have a net zero emissions by 2030. Mm-hmm. If that is going to happen, there's going to have to be some pretty radical policy. So is that policy, that target?
I want to achieve that if we can. There are obviously huge hurdles towards achieving it. It does mean a radical change in the way in which we generate electricity. It does mean huge investment in green energy. It also means a huge number of jobs being created in green energy, and it also means significant changes to agriculture and industrial practices.
And it also means flights as well, doesn't it? If you're going to be serious about meeting that kind of emission, you're going to have to look at potentially restricting flights, taxing flights.
It also means measuring properly. At the moment, the government is often not including airlines and shipping, or aircraft and shipping, in the measurement of emissions, and we're not including the emissions created through imported goods that we have. But let's be serious about this. The world as a whole is suffering global warming. The world as a whole is destroying the natural world at a very rapid rate. We have to do everything not just to protect, but to enhance our biodiversity. We have to have trade policies that reflect that, and we have to have domestic policies in this country that reflect that. So, if nothing else, the Extinction Rebellion has woken people up to the seriousness of this. And I think all of us have to recognise that. Yes, does it mean in the long term more efficient aircraft and fewer flights? Probably yes. It means moving towards more efficient railways, and railways in this country need more investment, I believe, but also it's very easy to take Eurostar from London to Brussels or Paris. It's actually incredibly expensive to take a train anywhere else in Europe, and a flight is often a fifth or less than the cost of a train. That surely needs to be looked at, all those kind of issues. A train is a much more sustainable way of transport than flying.
So you think there should be high taxes on flying?
Not necessarily high taxes, but improving land forms of transport as a way of reducing emissions. We've all got to do something about it, but we have to recognise that if we don't, then the problems are going to get worse.
I mean, you've said that you fly as little as possible now, and that you would continue to try and do so as Prime Minister. I mean, is that really realistic? Can you really have a Prime Minister who is, spending hours on a train trying to get to summits and so on? Is that an efficient way of your time?
A good train journey is an extremely efficient use of your time, because you can use a computer, you can use your phone, you can have conferences, you can talk to people, and it is not polluting the environment to the same extent that an aircraft does. I travel by train.
You might struggle to go to the UN though on a train.
Well, of course, if you're going transatlantic, it's a bit difficult to take a train. I get that, but Western Europe is not particularly a problem, and I travel always by train now. And I do spend a lot of time on trains, but you know what? I use the time as efficiently as I possibly can on trains, and I enjoy the journeys.
Now, if there is an election, I know you want to win a majority, of course, but we've all seen the polls. It is very possible that the only way that you could get into number 10 is with the support of smaller parties. So if the price of the SNP support was a second independence referendum in Scotland, is that something you could agree to?
If we win an election, we win an election, and we form a Labour government with all the transformative policies that I've outlined. We are not going into coalition with anybody. We will put our programme forward in Parliament. What I've said on the Scottish referendum is it's not our priority. We want to put £70 billion of investment into Scotland, and we would certainly not countenance it in the early days or early years of a Labour government, because I think the 2014 referendum was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
You see, there'll be some in Scottish Labour who are really worried about this. This is your opportunity to absolutely rule it out in any circumstances.
I've said very clear, we're not going into coalition with anybody, and I've made that very clear here and in Scotland.
So there is no
I'm
way
there campaigning all the time with Scottish Labour.
There is no way that you could give the green light to a second independence referendum if it meant that you could get into
What
number
I've
10.
said is that we don't think independence is a good idea. The income and expenditure figures for Scotland indicate that an independent Scotland would face massive austerity and loss of public spending.
It's not quite ruling it out.
No, but I'm saying that we would invest in Scotland, and we wouldn't even countenance it in the early years of a Labour government. I've said that very clearly in Scotland as well as here.
OK. Now, John McDonnell gave an interview with GQ earlier this week, and he said, he was asked if he would stay on as Labour leader if you lost an election. And he said, I think it's the same for my own personal position. I can't see so. What we do is as tradition, which is to have an election for a new leader. So I'm going to ask you directly, if you lose the next election, will you stand down as leader?
We're not expecting to lose the next election, so
oh, come on. John McDonnell gave an honest answer. Why can't you?
It's a hypothetical question, and it's up to the members of our party to decide who the leader is.
John McDonnell gave an answer.
He gave an answer.
Is he right? Does he speak for you?
John gave an answer to an interview that he undertook. My answer is this. I'm leading this party to go into an election. We have hundreds of thousands of members determined to win that election. I am utterly determined to get a message out there. It's only Labour that's going to end austerity and invest in a better future for this country, and I want to lead the party to do that.
John McDonnell also said he thinks that the next leader should be a woman. Do you think the next leader should be a woman?
It's not for me to decide who the next leader is. Obviously, a woman will be a candidate, of that I'm very, very sure. I'd also point out that since I became leader, there have been more women appointed to our front bench and shadow cabinet than ever before. There are more all-women shortlists, and the next parliamentary Labour Party will, in all probability, be a majority women membership.
Any particular rising stars you've got your eye on as future leaders?
There's lots of rising stars, and they're utterly brilliant people, and I enjoy working with them and campaigning with all of them. But I am not into the business of ordaining people.
Okay, nicely dodged. Mr. Corbyn, thank you very much.
Thank you.